have to look at the.
And I don't know the amount either. I agree with Scott that you can get them with pepper. And I guess if you got capsules without pepper, it's 1 or 2 a day, I imagine.
Okay, because I saw them on Amazon and there were different strengths. So I was just curious about that.
What strengths were they on the Amazon?
I don't remember.
Okay. Well, I'll try to do some Google searching around here, see if they come up with anything as we go on. The class goes on while Scott's doing his presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have any new people tonight? Anyone here for the first time? I pretty much recognize most of the names, I think, so far.
I just wanted to say something about the turmeric.
Yes, Joan.
I couldn't find it with pepper at Fred Meyer, but Walgreens does have it also.
Yeah, I've seen it at Costco with black pepper too.
Thanks for sharing that.
Just a lot more expensive that way than if you just eat the spice on your food if you're worried about the cost.
Remember the turmeric spice that Dr. Greger recommends. He usually recommends you do about a 1/4 teaspoon a day, but you can go up a 1/2 teaspoon, 3/4 a teaspoon if you're really having a lot of inflammation. So a 1/4 teaspoon is not a whole lot. That's why 1 or 2 of the capsules that you might be able to buy would probably be adequate. But then again, if you're not getting benefit, then you may want to add a little bit more. So there are a few more new faces that people that have jumped on here that I don't particularly recognize everybody, but you know, my memory is not the most superior. When it comes to faces and names, I've always been kind of poor at that. So if there's anyone new to the class, we're kind of curious how you found out about the class and what you might expect to find for benefits. All you need to do is kind of unmute yourself and I'll look and see if I can see you, or you can raise your hand, or you could put it in the chat. But if you unmute yourself, that would be great, and say hello.
Hi,
Dan?
hello.
Hello, Dan.
Hi, my name's Dan. This is my first time in the class. My doctor told me about it actually and said it might be a good resource, so I'm trying it out.
Well, welcome. Did your doctor grab you by the wrist and move your arm around your back and say, you've got to take these classes?
No, nothing like that.
Okay.
Nothing like that. Just it might be something, you know, you want to check out.
Well, good. Glad to have you. And if you have questions, you feel free to ask at any time.
Sure, thank you.
Anybody else? It looks like Stephanie's unmuted. We can hear you.
Okay, it's my first time.
Oh, well, great. So how did you find out about the classes?
Well, I've known about the classes from Scott for a while, and my cardiologist also recommended them.
You had 2 people motivating you or trying to motivate you to take these classes. Well, welcome. And again, if you have questions, you know, the price is right. These classes are for free for you. We kind of share the resources and the science, Scott and I, and we try to make it fun with a few videos here and there. And some people are a little uncomfortable asking questions, or they may need a little more help if they're new. They may want to try to do this and want to do it more quickly. And so we have a third-year medical student who's Lisa Chick, who she's waving her hand in the middle of the screen for those of you who've seen the view. And she does, one-on-one free counseling for you. And if she's not available, she'll let me know and I'll be available to help you out. I like to have her do it because, she's going to be influencing a lot more patients in her lifetime than I will be in mine at this point. And so anyway, it's a free resource for anybody who feels they just need a little bit more help or a lot more help potentially to help them on a path to doing something different, because you have a lot of cultural influences which kind of make it a little difficult to change your habits and do something different. And that's what these classes are about, to kind of bust some of the myths that you live under that are not really the healthiest ideas. And so welcome anyway. Anybody else who's new?
And for the new people, I'm going to show a couple of resources before I get started with the diabetes class. I'll give you a quick overview of the website before I show a couple of the resources that pertain to tonight's class. Any other questions, comments before I get started?
I have one request from everybody. If you're going to a cardiologist, do you have a plant-based cardiologist or someone who's actually supportive of doing whole food, plant-based lifestyle? And if you do, I'd love to have you share that name with me of the cardiologist. I personally know of one, but we're looking to see how many of those are in this area, in Eugene, Springfield area, or Roseburg, or on the coast, if you happen to know. And you can just go to the chat room and type in the name if you want, and I'll look it up. Okay, Scott, carry on.
All right, I'll jump in. All right, we're talking about diabetes tonight, part 1, and Charlie will continue next week. So since we have some new people, I want to go to the website here and show a couple of things.
What do they type in there, Scott, to get to the website?
It's www.livelifestylemedicine.com. Livelifestylemedicine.com right here. So this is the home page. You can see the address right here, livelifestylemedicine.com. And if you're new to the group, just come to this website and scroll down the home page here. And the first thing I recommend you do is scroll down to this website tutorial right here. So you just click on it. It's just a recording I made of about 15 minutes, and I give a full tour of what's all available on the website, how to access the archive classes that get recorded every week, all the different resources, cookbooks, videos, all other kinds of educational resources. So you can watch that as many times as you want to. You get kind of oriented to where things are on the website. So check that out. You can sign up for the weekly class newsletter. I put a warning here because a lot of times people will get the initial welcome email when they sign up, but then you'll get an email newsletter every Sunday morning, and sometimes it'll go to people's junk file. So if you're like, oh, I used to get the weekly email, or I got the welcome email initially, but haven't been getting it, then definitely check your junk file or spam folder, because it sometimes goes there, because it's a MailChimp account. So it's an automatically generated one. So sometimes it goes there. So just check on that. But tonight I want to show you a couple things pertaining to tonight's class. So if you go we click on resources, we can go to the different books, links to books here. There's a book related to tonight's class I recommend for anyone that has diabetes, pre-diabetes, maybe lives with somebody with diabetes. You just scroll down here. These are all the different books that we recommend for different classes. And for the diabetes class right here, it's called Mastering Diabetes by Cyrus Sambata and Robbie Barbaro. And there's a link to it on Amazon. And I think you could probably likely get it at the library as well if you want to check it out. But that's the book I recommend for tonight and next week as well, when Charlie continues on diabetes. And then the other thing I wanted to show you on the website, if you also click on back to resources tab, there's another tab here for handouts from classes. And there's a whole bunch of handouts here pertaining to the different classes we do over the year. But I want to bring your attention to one here. It says Scott's diabetes article about the cause of type 2 diabetes. So if you all the information I'm going to be going over tonight, you can, of course, we record the class so you can watch it as many times as you want if you didn't quite catch all the details I go over tonight. But this is also kind of like the Cliff Notes. This is an article I wrote several years ago that kind of gives a kind of representation of pretty much everything I'm going to talk about tonight. So it's a pretty long article, but it's all in writing for you, and you can read it as a good review. After tonight's class, you can go on the website and read that as a good review. So I just wanted to show you that as well. Any questions about the website? Close this down. Let me go back to pull up my PowerPoint here. You guys can hear me okay and see my screen okay? I should have checked that. All right.
Yep.
All right. Let's get started here. So those that are new. I'm Scott Wagnon. I'm a physician assistant at Oregon Medical Group. I've been a physician assistant for 18 years. And this particular class tonight's about diabetes. Always like to start with the quote, "There comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in." All right, so I'm going to talk about all the different kinds of diabetes, but first I want to kind of give you my diabetes story before I jump into it so you can kind of get a perspective of where I'm coming from when it comes to diabetes. So my first job back in 2005, I was working at a community health clinic in Salem, and we were pretty, can we make sure everyone's muted, Charlie?
Yeah, I'll do that.
First job was in community health, and we were kind of on a tight budget, and so we were.
I actually muted you. Wait a second.
There we go.
There you go.
Okay, you're good. All right, so we're on a kind of on a budget at this community health clinic in Salem. So we did refer out patients out that need to be referred, but we had, they encouraged us the areas of medicine that we had a lot of interest and knowledge in. We kind of referred within our own practice. So, like one of the providers down the hallway was really good at women's health, or another one was really good with chronic pain or kidney disease or diabetes or whatever. And my specialty is everyone muted? What's going on?
I guess it is another, okay. I have found a microphone that we can mute here. Okay.
All right. So anyway, I was the diabetes specialist at the clinic. So I got a lot of the really challenging patients with diabetes that got sent my way. And so because I read everything I could get a hold of, all the studies, every journal I could get a hold of what pertains to diabetes, I read it and was really interested in that. So that's how I kind of really got into diabetes. And then the story continues in 2008. The whole philosophy at that time was, hey, let's really get on top of patients with diabetes. Let's get their blood sugars down to close to normal. Because in theory, we thought, okay, if your blood sugars are normal, then maybe you won't have, even if you're on insulin and lots of medications, maybe you won't have the increased risk of strokes or heart attacks or amputations or blindness or kidney disease or any of the neuropathy, any of the things that we worry about with patients with diabetes, maybe they won't have those problems if we get their blood sugars down to normal. And so that was kind of the philosophy, and I was really good at doing that, like trying to get patients on insulin and really aggressive treatment, because that was kind of the focus at that time. And then in 2008, I went to the American Diabetes Association conference in San Francisco. And at that time, what was exciting about that year in 2008 was there was 3 big major studies that were going to be published, and the results were going to be revealed at this American Diabetes Association conference. And so we were all really excited to see if the regressive treatment was gonna pay dividends like we kind of had hoped. And the 3 trials were the VA study, the Accord trial, and the Advance trial. Those were the 3 big studies that released their results at that time. And unfortunately, 2 of the studies had to be stopped early because the patients that were being treated most aggressively were actually dying. They were dying sooner. And so it increased the risk of heart attacks and strokes and death. And so they had to stop those studies early because of that. And so we were really disappointed when we heard that, because it was like kind of like back to square one. What's going on? So there was, the aggressively treated group did have slightly less risk of the neuropathy and the kidney disease. And some of that was a little bit better, but it, was all trumped by they were dying sooner. So obviously, who cares if you have a little bit less kidney disease if you're going to be a higher risk of dying from a stroke or a heart attack. So we kind of had to go back to the drawing board. So that's kind of, I just wanted to give you that background before I jump into diabetes, the types of diabetes, and kind of how a whole food plant-based diet can be beneficial in a diet and lifestyle. So okay, so type 2 diabetes is what we're going to be mostly talking about tonight. It's 90 to 95% of all diabetes. Prediabetes is defined by either a fasting blood sugar of 100 to 125 or a hemoglobin A1C of 5.7 to 6.4%. So most of you, maybe some of you may or may not know what an A1C is. It's basically a blood test that is a 3-month average blood sugar. And so this percentage is kind of equates to a certain blood sugar average over a 24-hour period. And we turn over our blood cells about every 3 months. And so it's basically what's called glycosylated hemoglobin. So it's the sugar molecule that's attached to a hemoglobin molecule, and we can get a percent of that. And so anything that's 5.6% and below is considered normal. And then 5.7 up to 6.4% would be pre-diabetes. And then diabetes would actually be 6.5% and above when you utilize the A1C. So I just wanted to kind of give you those two. And just kind of going back to kind of pre-diabetes and type 2 diabetes, and we're talking about these, they're mostly lifestyle related, but there is a genetic component that we know. And so, but it's very, very prevalent. I'm going to go over prevalence here in just a little bit. But I just kind of wanted to connect those two. So when somebody has pre-diabetes and then they progress to diabetes with an A1C of 6.5 or more, we're talking about type 2 diabetes when we talk about that. And then type 1 diabetes is a type of autoimmune diabetes. And you kind of think of it as, we used to call it juvenile diabetes because most of the time it happens to children, but it can happen even into early adulthood as well. And so type 1 diabetes is autoimmune diabetes. So what that means is your own immune system attacks the cells in the pancreas that make insulin. And so now you don't make any more insulin. And so your blood sugars go really high and you have diabetes and you have to be on insulin because you don't make any more insulin. And so just think of it as your immune system attacks your cells to make insulin. You don't make any more insulin. So you need to take insulin because otherwise your sugars would go through the roof. That's all you have to really remember. And that's, very small percentage of all diabetes, less than 5%, but it's still important to talk about. And then we have a newer form of diabetes that's come about in the past several years called type 1.5 diabetes, or LADA. And LADA stands for latent autoimmune diabetes in adults. So it's kind of similar to type 1 diabetes, but what happens is usually somebody will previously have type 2 diabetes, and either they're on insulin or not, and then all of a sudden they seem to like almost act more like a patient with type 1 diabetes, and you're having to give them more and more insulin, and what's going on, and then you find out there's some ways to diagnose it, basically by checking some antibody tests and something called a fasting C-peptide, which is a blood test that tells how much insulin the person's making themselves from their pancreas. And so there's some diagnostic criteria, but just kind of think of it as, okay, it was somebody that had type 2, but now they basically have type 1. So now we call it this type 1.5. And it's becoming a little more prevalent, unfortunately. So the bad news with it would be is, if somebody had type 2 diabetes, we could potentially put it in reverse. We could put it in remission, get rid of it with diet and lifestyle. But then if somebody ends up having of course with type 1 or with type 1.5, maybe you could reverse a lot of the health conditions associated with diabetes and get the diabetes under good control, but you would likely never be able to get off of the insulin, because with type 1 and type 1.5 diabetes, you just don't really make any more insulin. So you're kind of stuck with insulin the rest of your life if you have one of those two. But fortunately, that's less than 5 between type 1 and type 1.5. That's about 5 to 10% of all diabetes. So not very prevalent like the type 2. And then we have gestational diabetes, which many of you probably understand. It's having diabetes when you're pregnant. So they'll do a glucose tolerance test. You always hear about pregnant women will get, and so it's basically having type 2 diabetes while you're pregnant, and often after the mother delivers the baby, it goes away. And so it happens to be, this insulin resistance is worsened by the pregnancy status, and then once the mother delivers the baby, it tends to go away. But it is often associated with prediabetes and type 2 diabetes. So it's a kind of a wake-up call. If a woman gets gestational diabetes with their pregnancy, then it definitely means they're at high risk for eventually developing type 2 diabetes. So any questions about those different types of diabetes before I move on? Okay. So let's look at some statistics and prevalence. So I updated these. In 2022, 37.3 million in the United States diagnosed with diabetes, and 96 million with prediabetes. And so essentially that is 133 million Americans with diabetes and prediabetes, which that would be a third of our population. And the scary thing is the 96 million with the prediabetes, only 1 out of 10 people that have prediabetes even know that they have it. So it's a lot of times we'll check it on routine blood tests that we do all the time, and either have elevated fasting glucose like I showed earlier, greater than 100, between 100 and 125. And sometimes when we see that, we'll say, oh, let's add this A1C, and then A1C ends up being between 5.7 and 6.4. And so that's how often it's, because there's really no symptoms related to it. It's just, oh, maybe a little bit of weight gain. Sometimes you'll see that, but you're not going to really have really high blood sugar or anything like that. So it's just this pre-diabetes state. So that's a third of our population, and the total and direct and indirect cost of diabetes in the United States is, as of 2018, was $327 billion. So that's from the CDC. So it's out there. It's a definite epidemic. So let's watch a quick video here from Dr. Greger about diabetes prevalence before we move on.
In just 1 decade, the number of people with diabetes has more than doubled. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, by 2050, 1 out of every 3 of us may have diabetes. What's the big deal? Well, the consequences of diabetes are legion. The number 1 cause of adult onset blindness, the number 1 cause of kidney failure, the number 1 cause of surgical amputations. What can we do to prevent it? Well, the onset of type 2 diabetes is gradual, with most individuals progressing through a state of prediabetes, a condition now striking approximately 1 in 3 Americans. But only about 1 in 10 even knows it. Since current methods of treating diabetes remain inadequate, prevention is preferable, but what works better, lifestyle changes or drugs? We didn't know until this landmark study was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. Thousands were randomized to get a good double dose of the leading anti-diabetes drug or diet and exercise. The drug, metformin, is probably the safest diabetes drug there is. Does cause diarrhea, and about half of those who take it makes 1 in 4 nauseous. About 1 in 10 suffer from asthenia, from the Greek meaning lack of strength, causing physical weakness and fatigue. But the risk of being killed by the drug is only about 1 in 66,000 every year. And the drug worked. Compared to placebo, in terms of the percentage of people developing diabetes within the 4-year study period, fewer people in the drug group developed diabetes. But diet and exercise alone worked better. A lifestyle intervention reduced diabetes incidence by 58% compared to only 31% with the drug. The lifestyle intervention was significantly more effective than the drug and had fewer side effects. More than 3/4 of those on the drug reported gastrointestinal symptoms, though there was more muscle soreness reported in the lifestyle group on account they were actually exercising. Other studies subsequently found the same result. Non-drug approaches superior to drug-based approaches for diabetes prevention. And the 50% or so drop in risk was not for people that actually improved their diet and lifestyle, but just those instructed to improve their diet and lifestyle, whether or not they actually did it. Check this out. This is one of the most famous diabetes prevention studies. 500 people with prediabetes randomized into a lifestyle intervention or a control group. And during the trial, the risk of diabetes was reduced by that same 50 to 60%. But only a fraction of the patients met the modest goals. Right? Even in the lifestyle intervention group, only about 1/4 were able to eat enough fiber, meaning whole plant foods, and cut down on enough saturated fat, which in this country is mostly dairy, dessert, chicken, and pork. But they did better than the control group, and fewer of them developed diabetes because of it. But what if you looked just at the folks that actually made the lifestyle changes, met at least 4 out of 5 of those wimpy goals? They had 0 diabetes. None of them got diabetes, 100% drop in risk. Bottom line, type 2 diabetes can be prevented by changes in lifestyle, even in high-risk pre-diabetic subjects. The fact then that type 2 diabetes, a largely preventable disorder, has reached such epidemic proportion is a public health humiliation.
Did you guys catch that? That the 60% drop in preventing diabetes after 4 years, and people just instructed to follow a healthier diet and lifestyle, but the ones that actually did follow the healthy diet and lifestyle changes, none of them developed diabetes. So it's really important that you picked up that detail. All right, well, let's talk about what causes type 2 diabetes. So I mentioned earlier, there is a genetic predisposition. But most of us have that predisposition, because since a third of us in the population has prediabetes or diabetes. And so it's important to realize, because you'll see people that, eat whatever they want and they stay thin and they don't develop diabetes, or you'll see some people that are very severely obese and they don't develop diabetes. So that there are these genetic factors that lead to whether or not somebody develops significant insulin resistance, which is the cause of type 2 diabetes. So there are other factors, but largely, 90-95% of it is all diet and lifestyle. So insulin resistance is what we believe is the cause of type 2 diabetes. And so I'm going to explain to you what insulin resistance is in many different ways, different angles, different videos, demonstrations, because it's really important to understand it. So what causes it? It's caused by the storage of fat in tissues that are not designed to store fat. So specifically think about, okay, so where are we supposed to store fat? Well, we're supposed to store it under our skin, right? Our subcutaneous tissue. because that's, it's the metabolic dollar for if we don't get any food, we have calories that we can draw from our fat stores, right? And so those of us that have survived to today from the hunter-gatherer days, the people that are good at storing body fat are those of us that have survived to today. So if you're somebody, we all know those people that could eat whatever they want and they never have any body fat on them, right? So that kind of a person would not have survived back in the days of hunter-gatherers, because starvation was one of the biggest causes of death back in those days. And so those of us that easily store fat, we're the ones that survive, because if you don't get food for weeks on end, you can still survive on your body fat. So that's what's the design of our human physiology, is to be able to store fat in our subcutaneous tissue. That's where we're supposed to store it. But what happens with insulin resistance is we store fat in places that's not supposed to be a storage organ for fat. So like in our muscle cells, you'll see it in the muscle cells, you'll see it in the liver, you'll see it in the pancreas. So think about the fat accumulating in places that's not designed. So we'll explain it a little. I'll explain it a little bit more later. But we can use fat for energy. So we use glucose first, but we can use fat for energy. So once we run out of our sugar stores in our muscles, which only takes about 12 to 24 hours, we then draw from our fat stores. And so there is supposed to be some fat in our muscles because we can use fat for energy. But when there's extra fat in the muscles and in the liver and the pancreas and places like that, it actually is toxic. It actually does bad things to us. And so why is insulin resistance bad? And I'll explain more insulin resistance in action here in a minute. But let's first just talk about, why is this insulin resistance bad? Why is it bad to store fat in those tissues that aren't designed to store fat? Well, insulin resistance influences all of these things. And this is actually only a brief list of the disease conditions that insulin resistance influences. So coronary artery disease, which is heart disease, cancer, all the types of diabetes. So you might be thinking, okay, well, insulin resistance causes type 2 diabetes, but even people that have type 1 and type 1.5 diabetes can actually also have insulin resistance. And we think that a lot of the reasons that even really well-controlled patients with diabetes, even type 1 and 1.5 diabetes, still die from heart attacks and strokes and have all the complications, is because they can still get insulin resistance, which causes all these health problems. So it plays a role in prediabetes and kidney disease, Alzheimer's disease. Actually, one of the other terms for Alzheimer's disease is type 3 diabetes, basically insulin resistance of the brain, is another theory as to one of the influences of insulin resistance on Alzheimer's disease and dementia. Fatty liver disease, which makes sense because if you're storing extra fat in the liver, there's fatty liver. And then high cholesterol, high blood pressure, obesity, polycystic ovarian syndrome, which is a condition women get where they get the insulin resistance actually causes them to not be able to ovulate. So they stop having periods, they're infertile, they can't get pregnant. But then when you actually reverse insulin resistance, suddenly they can ovulate and have a baby. And you'll see a lot of patients that have PCOS actually take that drug metformin, because it actually helps lower insulin resistance a little bit. So that's influence. And then neuropathy, which is the pain in your feet when you have things like diabetes. Retinopathy, which is can cause the blindness, and erectile dysfunction, because that's related to insulin resistance too. So you can see there's a lot of health conditions that are related to insulin resistance. So it's something that we don't want to have. We don't want to have insulin resistance. So I'm going to show another Greger video that talks a little bit more about insulin resistance here.
Both prediabetes and type 2 diabetes is caused by insulin resistance, which is now accepted to be closely associated with the accumulation of fat within our muscle cells. This fat toxicity inside our muscles is a major factor in the cause of insulin resistance in type 2 diabetes, as it interferes with the action of insulin. I've explored how fat makes our muscles insulin resistant, how that fat can come from the fat we eat or the fat we wear, and how all fats are not the same. It's the type of fat found predominantly in animal fats relative to plant fats. It appears to be especially deleterious with respect to fat-induced insulin insensitivity. But this insulin resistance in our muscles starts years before diabetes is diagnosed. This is a graph of fasting blood sugars in the 13 years prior to the onset of diabetes. Insulin resistance starts over a decade before diabetes is actually diagnosed, as blood sugar levels slowly start creeping up. And then all of a sudden, the pancreas conks out and blood sugars skyrocket. What could underlie this relatively rapid failure of insulin secretion? At first, the pancreas pumps out more and more insulin, trying to overcome the fat-induced insulin resistance in our muscles, and high insulin levels can lead to the accumulation of fat in our liver, called fatty liver disease. Before diagnosis of type 2 diabetes, there's a long, silent scream from the liver. As fat builds up in our liver, it becomes resistant to insulin too. Normally, the liver is constantly producing blood sugar to keep our brain alive between meals. As soon as we eat breakfast, though, the insulin released to deal with the meal normally turns off liver glucose production, which makes sense since we don't need it anymore. But filled with fat, the liver becomes insulin resistant like our muscles, and so doesn't respond to the breakfast signal, and so keeps pumping out blood sugar all day long on top of whatever we eat. So the pancreas pumps out even more insulin to deal with the high sugars, and our liver gets fatter and fatter. That's one of the two twin vicious cycles of diabetes. Fatty muscles, in the context of too many calories, leads to a fatty liver, which leads to an even fattier liver. This is all still before we have diabetes, but then the next vicious cycle starts. Now, fatty liver can be deadly, so the liver starts trying to offload the fat by dumping it back into the bloodstream in the form of something called VLDL, and that starts building up in the cells of the pancreas that produce insulin in the first place. So now we know how diabetes develops. Fatty muscles leads to a fatty liver, which leads to a fatty pancreas. It is now clear that type 2 diabetes is a condition of excess fat inside our organs. The only thing that was keeping us from diabetes, from unchecked skyrocketing blood sugars, is that pancreas, was working overtime, pumping out extra insulin to overcome insulin resistance. But as the so-called islet or beta cells in the pancreas are killed off by the fat buildup, insulin production starts to fail. And we're left with the worst of both worlds, the insulin resistance combined with a failing pancreas. Unable to then overcome the resistance, blood sugar levels go up, and we have type 2 diabetes. This has implications for cancer as well. Obesity leads to insulin resistance, and our blood sugars start to go up. So our pancreas starts pumping out more insulin to try to force more sugar into our muscles, and eventually the fat spills over into the pancreas as well, killing off the insulin-producing cells, and we've got diabetes. In which case, we may have to start injecting insulin at high levels to overcome the insulin resistance, and these high insulin levels promote cancer. It's one of the reasons we think obese women get more breast cancer. It all traces back to fat getting into our muscle cells, starting insulin resistance, fat from our stomach or fat going into our stomach. So now it should make sense why the American Diabetes Association also recommends reduced intake of dietary fat as a strategy for reducing the risk of developing diabetes.
All right, so one of the things I want to mention, how we figured out this fat in the muscle cells and the liver and the pancreas. One of the technologies that was used to kind of figure this out was something called a MR spectroscan. What that is, a magnetic resonance spectroscan. It's like an MRI, but what it can do is it can see where fat is accumulated. And one of the first populations that they studied was the Asian population. This is back maybe 10, 15, maybe even a little over 15 years ago. And so what's happening in Asian countries is they're starting to go away. Since like 1980s, they started going away from their primarily rice and vegetable based diets to more of a Western diet, eating more like Americans. And what was interesting is you know, because in America, it's usually people, you know, someone with type 2 diabetes, it's usually, you know, 20 pounds overweight, 40 pounds overweight, 60 pounds overweight. That's what we tend to see for the most part in America, people that develop diabetes for the most part, the vast majority. And what we were seeing in Asian countries, in Japan and China, was that a lot of times these people were developing type 2 diabetes before they were getting overweight. Like they would look fairly thin still, you know, maybe they're 5 or 10 pounds heavier than they were, a little bit overweight, but they were already developing insulin resistance. They're already developing type 2 diabetes before they were getting very overweight. And so it was kind of a head scratcher. And then they got this MR SpectraScan technology, and they started scanning their bodies, and it can see where the fat is. And so the fat's not all in their subcutaneous tissue, it's actually in their liver, it's in their muscles, it's in their pancreas, just like Dr. Greger showed on the video there. And so that's what kind of tipped us off to, oh, that's the problem. And so the demonstration I'm going to have all of us do right now, and then the next video will explain it, and actually in a graphic picture, a cartoon, you'll see it, and then we'll do a little thought experiment, active experiment here as well. Because when I used to teach these classes at the church live, I would get 10 volunteers, and everyone would have a role to play, and we actually role play what insulin resistance is. So you guys ready to do that with me here? Kind of use your imagination a little bit. Okay, so we're going to demonstrate this. So everyone looking around in their room, that they have their computer, and pretend that whether it's your computer in front of you or your cell phone, let's say that's the furnace inside your cell. And so the room you're sitting in is inside of a muscle cell. So pretend like your room you're in is inside of a muscle cell, and the computer or cell phone in front of you is what's called the mitochondria, which is what we call the powerhouse of the cell. But you can think of it as a furnace, like the furnace that burns up, that generates heat, right? And then the door that leads into your room that you're in, like my door is right behind me. The outside of that door, or whatever door you have closest to you, that's the bloodstream out there. So the bloodstream is the outside of your door, and you're inside of a muscle cell right now, and your computer or cell phone in front of you is your furnace. Okay, so let's demonstrate what normally happens in somebody that doesn't have any insulin resistance, that doesn't have prediabetes or type 2 diabetes. This is just normal human physiology. Okay, so what happens is you eat some food, right? And there's going to be some sugar, that blood sugar, it's going to go up because you ate food. And so the pancreas gets a signal and sends some insulin, because the insulin needs to unlock the door. The door is back there where the bloodstream is, and the insulin is like the key. It's going to unlock the door so that the sugar can come inside, and you can burn up that sugar in your mitochondria, in your furnace, right? So that sugar is going to come in, and insulin's going to unlock the door, sugar is going to come in, and your furnace is going to burn it up and create energy. Okay, so that's the normal situation. And there's a little bit of fat in here too, because we do eat. There's no such thing as a no-fat diet. Even a 100% whole food plant-based diet is still probably about 10-15% of the calories are still coming from fat. So you're burning up some sugar in here. You also can burn up some fat. So there's fat inside here, and your furnace is saying, hey, yeah, we can let some sugar in, because we got a little bit of fat in here, but we need a lot more energy than that. So yeah, let's let the sugar that's building up outside in the bloodstream, let's let that in. So insulin is able to open the door and get that sugar in. So that's the normal situation. But what happens with insulin resistance, as you've heard so far, is that there's too much fat, right? There's fat inside the muscle cell, remember? Fat in the muscle cell, fat in the liver, fat in the pancreas. And so now think about it, you're inside your muscle cell here, and there's tons of fat in here. And most of the fat that's the culprit is the saturated animal fat. So like, beef, pork, chicken, cheese, pastry, all the saturated animal fats that we're eating in the standard American diet, that's the fat that's the most harmful when it comes to this situation. So think about all that fat that's in here. And so now your mitochondria, your furnace that's sitting in front of you, when there's all that fat in there, you're now, let's say your sugar is still pretty high out there, outside in the bloodstream behind me. It's like, yeah, we need to let some sugar in. You know, the sugar's out there saying, hey, you know, the sugar's pretty high out here in the bloodstream. We want to come in. We need to be burned up. You need to let us in so the sugar can come down. And so the insulin is there knocking on the door saying, hey, furnace, can you let this sugar come in? We need to lower that blood sugar. You need to let us in so you can burn us up. But the furnace is saying, hey, no, you guys can't come in. We got so much fat in here. I got to burn up all this fat. You know, there's so much fat in here I can use for energy. I don't need to let any sugar in. No, you can't come in, because we need to burn up this fat first. And so that's exactly what insulin resistance is. The insulin is trying to open the door to let the sugar in, but the furnace is saying, no way, Jose. You know, we got all this fat to burn up. So that's what insulin resistance is. And I'm going to now show you a video that that kind of shows you a picture of this in a cartoon. So you can kind of use your imagination for this, but now I want to show a video that just kind of gives you a more accurate depiction of this.
Studies dating back nearly a century noted a striking finding. If you take young, healthy people and split them up into two groups, half on a fat-rich diet and the other half on a carb-rich diet, within just 2 days, this is what happens. The glucose intolerance skyrockets in the fatty diet group. In response to the same sugar water challenge, the group that had been shoveling in fat ended up with twice the blood sugar. As the amount of fat in the diet goes up, so does one's blood sugar spikes. It would take scientists nearly 7 decades to unravel this mystery, but it would end up holding the key to our current understanding of the cause of type 2 diabetes. When athletes carb load before a race, they're trying to build up the fuel supply within their muscles. They break down the starch into glucose in their digestive tract. It circulates as blood glucose, blood sugar, and is taken up by our muscles to be stored and burned for energy. Blood sugar, though, is like a vampire. It needs an invitation to come into our cells, and that invitation is insulin. Here's a muscle cell. Here's some blood sugar outside, waiting patiently to come in. Insulin is the key that unlocks the door to let sugar in our blood enter the muscle cell. When insulin attaches to the insulin receptor, it activates an enzyme, which activates another enzyme, which activates 2 more enzymes, which finally activates glucose transport, which acts as a gateway for glucose to enter the cell. So insulin is the key that unlocks the door into our muscle cells. What if there was no insulin, though? Well, blood sugar will be stuck out in the bloodstream, banging on the door to our muscles and not be able to get inside. And so with nowhere to go, sugar levels would rise and rise. That's what happens in type 1 diabetes. The cells in the pancreas that make insulin get destroyed, and without insulin, sugar in the blood can't get out of the blood into the muscles, and blood sugar rises. But there's a second way we could end up with high blood sugar. What if there's enough insulin, but the insulin doesn't work? The key is there, but something's gummed up the lock. This is called insulin resistance. Our muscle cells become resistant to the effect of insulin. What's gumming up the door locks in our muscle cells, preventing insulin from letting sugar in? Fat. What's called intramyocellular lipid, or fat inside our muscle cells. Fat in the bloodstream can build up inside the muscle cell, creating toxic fatty breakdown products and free radicals that can block the signaling pathway process. So no matter how much insulin we have out in our blood, it's not able to open the glucose gates, and blood sugar levels build up in the blood. This mechanism by which fat, specifically saturated fat, induces insulin resistance wasn't known until fancy MRI techniques were developed to see what was happening inside people's muscles as fat was infused into their bloodstream. That's how they found out that elevation of fat levels in the blood causes insulin resistance by inhibition of glucose transport into the muscles. And this can happen within just 3 hours. One hit of fat can start causing insulin resistance, inhibiting glucose uptake after just 160 minutes. Same thing happens in adolescents. You infuse fat into their bloodstream, it builds up in their muscles and decreases their insulin sensitivity, showing that increased fat in the blood can be an important contributor of insulin resistance. Then you can do the opposite experiment, lower the fat in people's blood, and the insulin resistance comes right down. Clear the fat out of the blood, and you can clear the sugar out of the blood. So that explains this finding. On a high-fat diet, the ketogenic diet, insulin doesn't work as well. Our bodies are insulin resistant. But as the amount of fat in our diet gets lower and lower, insulin works better and better. This is a clear demonstration that the sugar tolerance of even healthy individuals can be impaired by administering a low-carb, high-fat diet. But we can decrease insulin resistance, the cause of prediabetes, the cause of type 2 diabetes, by decreasing saturated fat intake.
Do you have any questions about insulin resistance so far? Were you surprised to hear that fat causes insulin resistance? Didn't many of you think that sugar was the cause of type 2 diabetes? It's actually fat that causes insulin resistance and which causes type 2 diabetes. Any questions about that? Might be a new information for a lot of you.
So Scott, where does saturated fat come from?
Saturated fat is the fat that, if you like bacon, for example, is always a good example. So if you fry bacon and all the bacon grease that's left over, it's when it's hot, it's liquidy, right? But what would happen if you dumped the bacon grease into a glass and left it out at room temperature for a day or two? It would be solid, right? It would actually be, you could stick your finger in it and it's like white and kind of, solid at room temperature. It's saturated fat is solid at room temperature. So it's basically the fat that comes from eating animals is a primary source, but also coconut oil is saturated fat, and then all the different palm oils and all the other kind of tropical oils that they use a lot in processed foods and pastries, cookies, things like that. Those are loaded with a lot of saturated fat. So it's primarily animal. So cheese is the number one cause or number one source of saturated fat. So cheese and pizza, which is more cheese, ice cream, pastries. Chicken is like the number 5 source of saturated fat, which might surprise a lot of you because there's less saturated fat in chicken than there is in beef or even pork or bacon or sausage. But because Americans eat so much chicken, it's the number 5 source of saturated fat in the American diet. So you're not really, by switching from beef to chicken, we sometimes think that's a better choice, but it's really not that much of a difference. And because, again, Americans eat so much chicken, that's a big source of saturated fat. So animal fat and then processed foods is where you're going to get most of your saturated fat. So there's one thing I want to talk. Yeah. Any other questions before I move on? So I want to talk about this keto caveat. So Dr. Greger mentioned it in the last video that when you're on a high fat, high protein, low carb diet, like, Atkins, those Atkins types of diets and, keto, sometimes paleo, South Beach, all those kind of old low carb diets, you're eating a high amount of fat and a high amount of protein and a low amount of carbohydrate. And so we need to really talk about how this relates to insulin resistance, because you just heard him say that, if you're eating a high fat diet, you're going to have more and more insulin resistance. And so then, some people might be confused because a lot of times when people go on a low carb diet or a keto diet, they tend to lose weight, and then they tend to, if they have type 2 diabetes, they tend to have lower blood sugars. They tend to need less medication. Their insulin dosages can go down. They actually look like they're getting better control of their diabetes. And they are in some ways because those numbers are getting better. And so then you might be confused. Well, how are your blood sugars going down and looking like you're doing better if your insulin resistance is worse? Well, it's because if you're keeping the carbohydrates low enough, you're not going to have high blood sugar because you're eating so low in carbohydrate that the blood sugar is not going to go high. But the way you'll know that you have really horrible insulin resistance, high levels of insulin resistance, there's two main ways. You can do what's called a glucose tolerance test, which, like I mentioned with the gestational diabetes, you get like a 75-gram dose of sugar, and then you check your blood sugar 2 hours later. And if it's greater than 200, that's diabetes. If it's between 140 and 199, that's pre-diabetes. And so you you do one of these glucose tolerance tests, and someone that's on a low carb diet, a high fat, low carb diet, will fail the glucose tolerance test miserably because they have horrible insulin resistance. You don't always have to do that. The other way to find out if you have insulin resistance is a much easier way is, and I do this with patients all the time. I'll have patients that have type 2 diabetes. They come see me and they're trying to make some changes toward a more whole food plant-based diet. And they say, well, Scott, whenever I eat fruit or rice and beans and stir fries, when I eat lots of high carbohydrate meals, my sugars go really high. And I have to tell them, well, that's because you have insulin resistance. And so it's the same thing as a glucose tolerance test. So it's not until enough time goes by that they get rid of the red light foods we call the meat, the dairy, the saturated fat, the pastries, the ice cream, the cheese, all the processed foods and all that. We got to get rid of those foods so that we can get that fat out of those muscle cells, out of the liver, out of the pancreas, like we've been talking about tonight. We got to get those foods out so we can reduce that insulin resistance, so that maybe 6 weeks from now or 3 months from now or 6 months from now, you will be able to eat that fruit and that rice and beans, and your sugar will not go too high because you've reversed the insulin resistance. And so this keto diet will hide insulin resistance because of those reasons. And so sometimes you'll hear people say, well, my A1C is lower. I'm eating a keto diet, a low carb, high fat, high protein diet, and my A1C is going lower. My fasting insulin levels are lower. My insulin requirements are going down. My fasting blood sugar is going down. And those are, signs of good control of diabetes. But it's when you're trying to figure out if you're reversing insulin resistance, which, as we've learned tonight, is the cause of the type 2 diabetes, and likely the cause of most of the complications, the heart attacks, the strokes, the blindness, the kidney failure, the amputations. The insulin resistance is playing a huge role in all of those things. And if we don't reverse the insulin resistance, we're not reversing or treating the causation of the type 2 diabetes. And so these markers, A1C, fasting insulin requirements, fasting blood sugar, that's incomplete information about the presence of insulin resistance. We need to do either the glucose tolerance test or just, like I said earlier, how does your blood sugar respond when you eat a potato or rice and beans or a bowl of fruit? And if they say, well, yeah, it shoots through the roof, well, that means you have insulin resistance. And so, sometimes if you read in the Mastering Diabetes book, we talk about, if you're gonna, once you're making you're making a transition and you're trying to start eliminating these red light foods, the meat, the dairy, the eggs, the oils, the processed foods, as you're working on making these dietary changes, you might have to limit how much of the high glycemic foods you eat. You might have to take it a little bit easy on fruit. You might have to take it a little bit easier on potatoes and rice and pasta and some of those things, at least initially, just to so you aren't freaking out that your blood sugars are going too high. And I try to tell my patients, I do have to cut down their insulin and some of their medications, but I still need to use the medications, especially if they have a lot of insulin resistance, because we can't, if their blood sugars get too high, we don't want them to get too low. That's more dangerous, but we can't let them get up to 300, 400, 500 or anything. We have to use enough medication to kind of control things while they're making the changes, getting rid of the foods that are causing the insulin resistance. And so it can take some time sometimes. And the other important thing about this keto caveat is people it's crazy that, that there's any doctors that recommend a low carb diet for anyone with type 2 diabetes, because we know that the saturated fat and all these meat, dairy, and eggs and oils and all the saturated processed food, that's the number one cause of death in the diabetes population, just like in the standard American population is heart disease. And so not only is it the number one cause of death in the regular population, but in type 2 diabetes, but we consider having type 2 diabetes as a risk equivalent for heart disease. And what that means, a risk equivalent, what that means is you have if someone that has type 2 diabetes has the same risk of having a heart attack or a stroke as somebody that has already had a heart attack or a stroke. So that's really huge. So if you think about, oh, someone that's already had a heart attack or a stroke, everyone knows that person's at high risk of having another one. And so just having type 2 diabetes puts you at that risk. And so that's why it's so important. You know, we have our standard medical training and medical model is so geared at just controlling diabetes, which, don't get me wrong, controlling diabetes is really important. It's better to have controlled diabetes than uncontrolled diabetes. But what's more important than that is we want to get rid of the diabetes, because we don't want to have the high risk of having a heart attack and a stroke and all these complications. We actually want to treat the causation, the insulin resistance, so that we don't have diabetes anymore. So we can stop taking our insulin and all our medications if we can. And so it does take a lot, more significant change to be able to reverse a chronic condition like diabetes than it does to prevent it. So if you already have diabetes, you might want to consider, for 30 days going all in on a whole food plant-based diet to be able to really see the benefits. But if you take baby steps like we talk about in the classes too, it's not like you're not going to get some benefit. You will, but it's difficult to reverse that insulin resistance if you are still eating the foods that are causing insulin resistance. So it was really important to talk about, because keto is so popular. I wanted to talk about that because that it's hiding that insulin resistance, and that's so important when it comes to that. So any questions about that? Any questions in the chat, Charlie?
No questions in the chat.
Okay. Let's move on here. So I'm going to talk about some other things besides diet that influence insulin resistance. So exercise is huge, especially with insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. So a couple little tips on that is that exercising muscle, it does not take as much insulin to let the sugar come inside. So remember how, the insulin's knocking on the door. Hey, we got lots of sugar out here. Can you let us in? Can you let us in? And so exercising muscle is like, oh yeah, it's a swinging door. It's like, it's not a big steel door. It's like, oh yeah, exercising muscle, it's really easy for the insulin to open up the door and let that sugar come inside. So exercise is so important. So whether you're out walking, just movement, resistance exercise, so important for that. And what's really amazing or cool about it is for a full 24 to 72 hours after every bout of exercise or movement you do, you get the benefits of that effect. You get what's called reduced insulin resistance. So the goal is to reduce insulin resistance and increase insulin sensitivity. So does that make sense? So lowering insulin resistance is good because you want the insulin to work like it's supposed to, and you want insulin sensitivity to go up. So what that means is for a small and smaller amount of insulin, it does its job. So it doesn't take very much insulin to do its job if you have high insulin sensitivity. And at the same time you have high insulin sensitivity, you have low insulin resistance. So those two things kind of make sense. And so exercising muscle for a 24 to 72 hours after a bout of exercise or activity, you have lower insulin resistance, higher insulin sensitivity. It's easier for the sugar to come inside into your muscle cells. And then sleep is important too, because if you're kind of goes together with stress. So if you're stressed all the time, you aren't sleeping well, you're also, because you're not sleeping well, you're stressed, it releases more what's called cortisol, which is kind of our stress hormone. And so that gets secreted by the adrenal glands. And then what happens with high cortisol levels is you have higher insulin resistance and lower insulin sensitivity. So it actually worsens the condition, worsens insulin resistance, lowers insulin sensitivity. So if you're even if you have a good diet, if you're not exercising, you're not sleeping well, if you're having a lot of stress, it's going to be difficult to reverse that insulin resistance. So those are very important as well, those three things. And then there's one more video I want to share with you from Dr. Greger, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions.
Type 2 diabetes can be prevented, arrested, and even reversed with a plant-based diet. Something we've known since back in the 1930s. Within 5 years, about a quarter of the diabetics were able to get off insulin altogether. But plant-based diets are relatively low-calorie diets. Maybe their diabetes just got better because they lost so much weight. To tease that out, what you need to do is a study where you switch people to a healthy diet, but force them to eat so much food that they don't lose any weight. Then we can see if plant-based diets have specific benefits beyond just all the easy weight loss. Well, we'd have to wait 44 years, but here it is. Subjects were weighed every day. If they started losing weight, they were made to eat more food. In fact, so much more food that some of the participants had problems eating it all. They were like, oh, not another salad. But they eventually adapted. So no significant weight change despite restricting meat, eggs, dairy, and junk. So with zero weight loss, did a plant-based diet still help? Overall, insulin requirements were cut about 60%, and half the diabetics were able to get off their insulin altogether, despite no change in weight. How many years did that take? No, 16 days. 16 days later. So we're talking diabetics who've had diabetes as long as 20 years, injecting 20 units of insulin a day, and then as few as 13 days later, they're off all their insulin altogether, thanks to less than 2 weeks on a plant-based diet, even with zero weight loss. Diabetes for 20 years, and then off all insulin in less than 2 weeks. Diabetes for 20 years because no one had told her about a plant-based diet. Here's patient number 15, 32 units of insulin on the control diet, and then 18 days later on none. Lower blood sugars on 32 units less insulin. That's the power of plants. And that was without any weight loss. His body just started working that much better. And as a bonus, their cholesterol dropped like a rock to under 150 in 16 days. Just like moderate changes in diet usually only result in moderate reductions in cholesterol, how moderate do you want your diabetes? Everything in moderation may be a truer statement than some people realize. And moderate changes in diet can leave diabetics with moderate blindness, moderate kidney failure, moderate amputation, maybe just a few toes or something. Moderation in all things is not necessarily a good thing. Remember that study that purported to show that diets high in meat, eggs, and dairy could be harmful to health as smoking, suggesting that people who eat lots of animal protein are 4 times as likely to die from cancer or diabetes. But if you look at the actual study, you'll see that's simply not true. Those eating a lot of animal protein didn't have just 4 times the risk of dying from diabetes. They had 73 times the risk of dying from diabetes. Now, those that chose moderation, only eating a moderate of animal protein, they just had 23 times the risk of death from diabetes.
All right, we'll finish off with my PowerPoint with another quote. We can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. So it's a different paradigm. It's a different way to think about it, but it's really what the science shows. And it's unfortunate that we still have those kind of myths out there that, you know, people still think that sugar causes diabetes. It's not that sugar is healthy. It's empty calories. It's processed. It's not good, but it's actually not caused. It's not the cause of the type 2 diabetes. It's kind of like saying, you know, if carbohydrates were the cause of type 2 diabetes, then you'd think that populations that have let's see, I'm trying to stop sharing. Populations that eat 80 to 85% of their calories from carbohydrates should be riddled with diabetes, but that's what the blue zones are. The blue zones eat 80 to 85% of their calories from carbohydrate, and they have almost no diabetes amongst the population. So we know there's a problem with that. It's kind of like saying, if you think about it, if carbohydrate or sugar is the cause of diabetes, that's like saying that a sore throat is the cause of the common cold. It's just a symptom. So having a high blood sugar is a symptom of insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes, as you've learned tonight. So you know that insulin resistance keeps the sugar from, keeps it stuck in the blood, doesn't get to come inside and get burned up. And so that's a symptom. So that's the symptom of the insulin resistance. Whereas we know what the cause of the insulin resistance is. It's the fat in the muscle cell and the liver and the pancreas. That's what's causing the insulin resistance. So we need to get rid of that. And then you won't have the sore throat anymore, right? The virus causes the common cold, not the sore throat. The sore throat is a symptom. So the fat is the equivalent of the virus. The fat in all the animal products and the processed foods and all that. That's the real cause. So we'll open it up to questions, comments, everything.
So Scott, there's a question in the chat room. Would it be possible to get the name of these nutrition facts videos? One of them is how not to die from diabetes, the Gregor video. Do you happen to know the other names?
Yeah. Let me show you a good way to do it. We'll do our nutrition facts thing here. Let's do. So nutritionfacts.org, we'll go to that website. And the best thing you can do, you can either just type diabetes in the search bar, or you can go down to the video library and browse videos by topic, and then just go down, go to D for diabetes, and just click on. I'm not seeing it. How's it doing that? Let's see. Popular topics. Keto. I guess it's better just to type. Usually they'll have videos by topic, but let's do diabetes.
Diabetes was in the fourth column. In the
Okay.
news.
So here's all the different videos related to diabetes. So you can just start scrolling down here. Look at all the different ones, and there's even newer ones than the ones I'm using, just because I had those embedded in. But yes, there's a ton of diabetes related videos you can check out, and articles and things. So that's always a good way to go. Of course, you could just the class was recorded, so you could always just show them that, but you could replay it and look up the title of the video. But there's a ton of really good videos on diabetes in here on nutritionfacts.org.
Okay, another question is, it's sort of the first part. Any thoughts on water fasting to reset your metabolism or insulin sensitivity?
Well, if somebody has diabetes, type 2, well, any kind of diabetes, we've got to really be careful about doing any kind of fasting, because if you're on medication, insulin or sulfonylureas like glipizide, glyburide, many of the other ones, the injectables and things, you could get, your blood sugar could get too low if you do fasting. So anyone that has type 2 diabetes and is on medication, you would have to be in contact with your medical provider. And I would generally recommend against fasting if you have diabetes. So it's more important what you put in your body when you are eating to treat that insulin resistance. But if you're just trying to prevent diabetes and you're not on any medication, then up to 24-hour water only fast is okay. Anything longer than that needs to be medically supervised.
Yeah, and I think you can get medical supervision down at McDougall's program.
No, it's True North Health Center in Santa Rosa.
Yeah.
That's with Alan Goldhammer and
Goldhammer.
Yeah, they do medically supervised water only fasting there.
Someone asks, might you add Dr. Barnard's book about reversing diabetes to the class website?
Yeah, actually, I've read his book. I don't have it on there, but let me show you really quick. I always like to go back to the website just to show you all the great resources. Another really great video I recommend. So here's our class website, and then you can click on videos up in the top tab here. And one of my favorite videos of Neil Barnard is talking about diabetes right here. Wonderful and straightforward 37-minute lecture on type 2 diabetes with Dr. Neil Barnard of the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. So watch this, click it here. It's the video quality is a little bit low because it's somebody filming it. He's inside of a bookstore, and but it's a good summary of his Reversing Diabetes book. But it's really, I highly recommend this 37-minute lecture here because he talks a lot about everything I talked about tonight. It's a good summary. So check that out.
Okay, and then how do alcoholics get a fatty liver if there's no fat in alcohol?
Yeah, it has to do with the metabolism. So, you know, the liver has to detoxify, basically detoxifies everything, but it's very toxic to the liver. And actually alcohol is really high in calories. So we talk about, you know, fat is 9 calories per gram, and protein is 4 calories per gram, and carbohydrates are also 4 calories per gram. Alcohol is 7 calories per gram. So it's almost as high as fat. So it kind of acts a lot like fat in the body. So alcohol causes a lot of liver toxicity and causes fatty liver. But now the number one cause of fatty liver disease is now our diet. It basically, alcohol has been pushed to second place now. It used to be that alcohol was the number one cause of fatty liver and liver cirrhosis, but now it's what we call non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, NASH, non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. So steato means fat, and hepatitis means hep is liver, and itis is inflammation. So fat caused inflammation of the liver is this non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, NASH. And that's now the number one cause of liver cirrhosis, liver cancer. It's higher now than hepatitis C, higher than hepatitis B, higher than alcohol. But they all can cause liver cirrhosis. So it's really important if you have fatty liver that you go on a more whole food plant-based diet, get rid of the alcohol, get rid of the white sugar, white flour, all the saturated animal fats, all the animal products. You can actually reverse fatty liver disease.
And then another question, how much water do people actually need to drink?
Yeah, the best way to, there's a couple ways you can tell. So because it's going to vary differently depending on your body size, your muscle mass, your activity level, how much you sweat, how much, you know, what kind of food you eat. Because if you're eating a lot of animal products and processed foods, they tend to be really low in water, whereas whole plant foods are high in water content. So if you're eating a lot of whole plant foods, you don't probably need to drink as much water as if you're eating a standard American diet that's low in animal or in plant products, because that's where a lot of the trapped water is in the plant products. But then the other way to tell is just to go, okay, you should be urinating every 2 to 4 hours. Your urine should kind of look like like watered down lemonade. It should be pretty clear with a slight yellow tinge. And then a more scientific method to determine whether you're hydrated enough is you completely empty your bladder. So go to the bathroom, completely empty the bladder, and then you drink 24 ounces of water. So that's 3 8-ounce cups. So you would all at once, you would drink 24 ounces of water. And then 1 hour from when you peed and drank the water, you should pee out a cup, an 8-ounce cup of urine. And if you don't, so if you drank 3 cups of water, which is 24 ounces, and you didn't pee out 8 ounces or a cup an hour later, then that's a sign that you need to drink more. And but there's a lot of other things that influence it too. Like, if you ate a saltier food, you might retain more water. Sometimes women on their menstruation will retain more water. So there's hormonal things that can influence it, but that's a good rudimentary test. But I think the easiest way to do it is, I'm peeing every 2 to 4 hours and my urine's pretty clear with a slight yellow tinge.
Okay, for the new people, I would highly encourage you to go to the website and check out the 2 introductory lectures, one by Scott, one by myself. And then if you have any issues with weight or food addiction, which is common to most all of us. You may go back to last year's archive section on food addiction, which is a really important one, which a lot of people struggle with.
We did that this year already, Charlie. So you just go to class archives on the homepage, and then here's 2023 classes. And so go back to the beginning of the year. So here's the introductory classes Charlie was just talking about, mine and Charlie's. And then we have meal preparation and planning. And then in February, we did weight management, a couple classes on. We did a food addiction and behavior change right here. And then in March was kind of some mental health topics. And then we're up to nutritional myths and the diet wars, and then diabetes now. So that's, but yeah, there's a bunch of other topics that Charlie was mentioning. If you wanted to go just searching for some of the other topics you might be interested in, you just go back to 2022 class archives, and you can see all the different topics. There's a whole bunch, and we'll be getting to these this year as well. Cancer and high blood pressure and kidney disease, autoimmune disease, gastrointestinal problems, food label reading, Alzheimer's, dementia, osteoporosis, other topics related to the environment, just a whole bunch of topics you can scroll through from 2022, which we'll get to all those eventually here this year.
Our goal is not to overwhelm you with information, but it is to kind of keep you immersed if you choose to. Kind of the more you listen to the actual science of healthy eating and the science of nutrition, the more likely you are to make some habit changes. And as you understand the benefits and as you do more thinking about this, what is it that you want to choose for your body? Joan.
I know there are people in my, my friends, family that would benefit, but I don't know how to lead them to this way of lifestyle. I'm just frustrated. You bring it up the topic and they think, oh, you're, a vegan hippie or something.
Yeah, the vegan hippie is a barrier to change for sure. That's why we don't like to use the word vegan. Well, we like to use whole plant foods. And there are various things that you can do, but when it comes to your own family, be very careful, because they're probably not going to be very happy about you making the change, because you're sort of leaving the tribe. Scott talks about the tribe a lot, and I've come to understand the meaning of that more and more. And especially with my own family, they were not very happy with me for my first 5 or 6 years, continually bringing up the importance of this. It led to less interaction. It led to less activities together. And so I would say if you have a friend or you have someone who you meet who you don't know, but you'd have a better chance of encouraging them to hop on and look at the resources. But if you just share the website and you say, hey, hey, there's this site that I went to, I've learned some good, interesting information, you might choose to check it out yourself. And as they see you gaining more and more health, it may take them 6 months, a year, 2 years, 5 years. The seed's been planted, they may choose to go. Scott, do you have anything to add? And then we'll ask Lisa about her thoughts.
Yeah, it took my wife 3 years to come around. So, it was a process. But I think the other bit of advice I could give is always just keep it positive. So like positive messaging. So it kind of like, instead of kind of focusing on what your friends and family shouldn't be eating, try to focus on what they could add to their diet. So like you could give them Dr. Greger's Daily Dozen, for example, and just say, hey, a challenge would be just to see, if you could, how many of the Dr. Greger Daily Dozen you could fit into your diet every day. And then that, then you're not focusing on the fact that they're, you have to tell them that they shouldn't eat meat or shouldn't eat dairy or shouldn't eat processed foods, but just say, there's a lot of science showing that all the health benefits of eating more fruits and vegetables and beans and whole grains and things like that. And so then you're focusing on, hey, not judging them for what they're still eating, but then you're just focusing on, hey, I got in, I got in all the fruit and whole grains that Dr. Greger recommended this past week, and just, oh, cool, and give them a lot of positive reinforcement for that. And then, that's a good place to start. And just always, lead by example, and, cook something that's plant-based and bring it to a gathering, and you're eating it, and it's like, oh, this is what I brought, this chili, you don't even have to say it's plant-based. Just say, oh, this is the chili I made, and you're eating it, and it, happens to be, it's all beans and vegetables. It's a plant-based chili, but they just know it tastes pretty good. And, you don't even have to bring up the fact that it's plant-based necessarily. So there's just some of the tips I can think of, and Lisa can chime in if she has some ideas.
Took my family closer to 10 years. I wasn't very pushy about it though, because it was such a source of stress and just tension. So I just ate the way that I ate and kind of just tried to lead by example and not really push anything on them. But eventually they just saw that it was a sustainable diet for me, and they started becoming more plant-based themselves, and it was all their decision. So I think that's a good way to do it, so that you're not, like Scott said, pushing anything onto them that they don't want at that time. Some people just aren't ready for it yet. And then another thing that I like to do is just to notice if somebody says, oh, I've got low back pain, or my joints are hurting because I've got arthritis. And then you can send them a video from Nutrition Facts, because there's likely a video on there that talks about diet and whatever disease or problem that they are concerned about. So just hanging on to like one little thing that they've said that's bothering them, and figuring out how a plant-based diet could possibly help them.
Does it help to recommend the Forks Over Knives video as a starter?
Yeah, I would say so.
I'll second it.
The first movie I watched, but yeah, it depends if they're ready or not to watch it. That was the video I tried to get my wife to watch. It took 3 years for me to talk her into watching it. And then for her, that was it. When she watched that, she was like, okay, I need to do this. That was what triggered her to make the change. But that might not be the same for everybody, but yeah, if they're willing to watch it, that's great.
Thank you.
Hey guys, can you hear me? This is Ken.
Hello, Ken.
Hey, I meet a lot of people that have read that book, Forks Over Knives, and most of them don't change their way of life, but they start thinking a lot more about healthy eating, and they definitely understand why I'm doing what I'm doing. So it's a very popular movie, and there's a magazine called that, and that's just a positive thing. A lot of people are paying attention, and it may, like you said, take years for them to decide, hey, I'm going to try it. Now, I wanted to ask you, I was late getting in as usual, so I may have missed this if you brought it up, but there's a lot of immunity disorders like rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, Crohn's. They just go on and on. They're immunity disorders. So your immune system's attacking you in some way because it's overactive. Type 1 diabetes is considered an immunity disorder. Could you explain why it's an immunity disorder?
Yeah, because basically your immune system attacks the cells that make insulin, so you don't make any more insulin. So it's pretty
Okay.
Is that? Yeah.
That's what you've been saying the whole hour.
Oh, just at the beginning. Yeah, when I talked briefly about type 1 diabetes, but that's good to get the reinforcement.
Yeah, the autoimmune disorder is your body has organs and cells, and normally it doesn't attack itself and kill those cells. And the autoimmune response is the body starts killing its own cells and organs, which is not what you would call particularly normal. It leads to inflammation and all the other problems that are associated with damaging your body. So, Mary,
I've found that the movie Game Changers is really beneficial for people who are athletic. It made a big difference to Craig and other people. It's a stunning movie. So if they're not quite ready for Forks Over Knives, they can watch these athletes and see what happened to them when they changed their diets.
good suggestion. Thank you.
It's on net, that one's back on, it's on Netflix still, I believe. We also have it on the Gene Plant-Based Providers website. Show you real quick, I have some documentaries there. Here. We go to documentaries on eugeneplantbasedproviders.com. We have some, it is right at the top, so Game Changers. I think if you click it, it takes you to you, if it takes you to, let me see if it, what platform, yeah, watch now on Netflix. You can stream it on Netflix if you have Netflix. That's a really good one.
Okay, it looks like we have time for one more question. If there's anybody else who cares to chime in, just can't wait until next week. Kim,
Yeah, was it Dr. Greger or was it you or Scott that said that somebody is calling diabetes the relationship between diabetes and Alzheimer's, like the new Alzheimer's? Is that?
Or you kind of type 3 diabetes. It's
Oh, that's what it is. Yeah.
insulin resistance of the brain. It's not really, a universal term or, super official, but it's got, all the different metabolic problems that all the Alzheimer's researchers talk about. Insulin resistance of the brain is a big part of Alzheimer's.
Are you going to be talking more about that next week in part 2?
Not necessarily. I don't think Charlie has anything on that, but we do have a class dedicated to Alzheimer's, but later on, but.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
and Kim, as follow-up from this afternoon, the thyroid and diabetes associate, how they're associated. There is an association. Just do a Google search and you'll find an article about how, sort of what we talked about is if you have hypothyroidism, it can, lead to excess weight and, affect your diabetes. And the bottom line is, treat your diabetes. And how are you going to treat your diabetes? Scott went over it tonight. Treat the root cause, which is the food, eliminate the saturated fats from your diet. And then as far as the thyroid condition, adjust them, and then maybe your diabetes will improve a bit. So they can affect each other, both directions.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yep. This has been fun. Scott, thanks a bunch, and Lisa and everybody else for the questions. And we're not done just because we're done tonight. We're looking forward to next week. It should be fun. We'll do a little more diabetes next week.
All right.
Hey, Scott, can I ask you a question that's not about food?
Yeah, sure.
Just before you showed something about the Game Changers, there was a picture of a perfect glaciated gorge. That happened to be in the Steens Mountain.
I was in the Steens Mountains.
No, I'm wondering, did you see that? I mean, you
Oh.
you showed it, a picture of a gorge.
Oh, that's the homepage for Eugene Plant-Based Providers. I'm not
Oh,
sure. That's, Sean does our website for Eugene Plant-Based Providers.
looks like Cogger Gorge on the Steens Mountain.
Let's
Gorge.
see.
Hey, thanks, everybody. See you later.
Thank you all.
Right
Take
there.
care.
Okay, maybe it looks like it could be the gorge, huh? Yeah,
Yeah. Pretty cool.
all right.
Let's see if I can figure out a way to get out of here.
And record.
Yeah. Until next time, everyone.